Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series on Oscar Wilde's The Decay of Lying. In this video we're going to be taking a look at what is aestheticism. Now, aestheticism is the name for the viewpoint that Oscar Wilde promotes in The Decay of Lying. The view is most simply described as art for art's sake. Aestheticism is also a name for a corresponding movement in art in the late 1800s that focused on the power of beauty to revitalize life initially and eventually became insistent on the independence of art from life. We're not going to focus so much on the broader aestheticism movement, but rather we're going to focus on the distilled philosophical position here that talks about what the purpose of art is. This is most commonly associated with Wilde, as well as James McNeill Whistler of Whistler's Mother, Walter Pater, and to a certain degree, John Ruskin. Check out the first video in this series for a primer on Wilde's Decay of Lying, a seminal text in the aestheticism movement. Now, aestheticism is less a single doctrine and more a collection of closely related claims about the purpose of art. They can be outlined in a number of different ways, but one way they might be outlined is as follows. Art should not copy reality. Art should strive to perfect its medium, and content should be subservient to medium. Life does and should strive to imitate art. The role of the critic is a creative and uninterpretive one. Art is independent of moral critique, and art is independent of the public's desire to define it, enjoy it, or attach it to a particular narrative. It's okay if those didn't make any sense. We're going to break them down one at a time and talk about what the aestheticists really mean when they say each of these points. So, one of the key components of aestheticism is a rejection of realism. For the aestheticist, sometimes called an aesthete, nature is an insufficient model for art. Nature is often wrong, imperfect, and therefore a poor model for art that strives to be beautiful and perfect its form. Aestheticists argue that the artist should rely on their imagination over their eyes or senses. Art should strive to create the perfection of its form in the most beautiful way, through the artist's imagination, not through correspondence to our imperfect reality. Now, the proponent of aestheticism advocates that the medium should take precedence over the content. Something should be made less real to fit the form better. If it would make a better story for events to happen in a different order, they should. If the painting would be more beautiful if objects were moved or if it were set at a different time of day, then that should be changed. The content should be made subservient to the form. Whistler's paintings, being named after musical compositions, is an embodiment of this aestheticist view that music is the form that all other arts should strive towards. This is because music has become completely divorced from realist descriptions of the world and is solely focused on perfecting a form. Now, the aestheticist does not merely claim that art should not imitate life. They claim that life, in fact, imitates art. This claim can be seen in a couple of different ways. First, it can be seen as the claim that our perception of reality is shaped by the art that we consume. The artist defines tropes, archetypes, and expectations of what life should be like. And we use these stories, these visual and narrative shorthands, to characterize our lives, to divide our world into different buckets and our experiences and desires into different places. We model our lives and our understanding of the world off of the stories and art that we consume. And therefore, our art imitates life because the only way we can draw those divisions in the world is from understanding the way that they're presented in art. Second, it can be seen as the desire of humans to make their lives more like the art that we see. We see something beautiful in a piece of art, and we want to recreate it in reality. We want to turn our lives into the perfection that we see in art. For the aestheticist, we in fact should. Some argue that Wilde himself, through his idiosyncratic style, dress, and mannerisms, was exemplifying this very idea, that he was in some ways making himself into a piece of art, something that was creating an image of something that was more perfect than he was. Now, there are many interesting connections we might draw between this and Wilde's Portrait of Dorian Gray, or the fact that Wilde was a closeted gay man in a deeply homophobic culture, but those will need to await another video. For now, it's sufficient to understand that in one way of saying that life imitates art, we're talking about the desire of people to turn their lives, their performance, their who they are into a form of art, or into a performance of some kind, based on the idea of wanting to perfect who they are by performing as different than they are. Now, the aestheticism movement had a unique view on artistic criticism. Specifically, for the aestheticist, criticism should be formalist, i.e., based on the perfection of the art to its form, not its content. This is contrasted with traditional interpretive criticism, where the critic distills the meaning of the artistic work, dispelling its artistic value and summing it up in the way that it should be understood. For the aestheticists, this was a problem, as this presupposes a functionalism on the art, that it was created for X specific purpose or X specific meaning, which is antithetical to the idea of art for art's sake, that art wasn't created for a specific meaning, but was rather created to be beautiful. Instead, the aestheticist proposes that critics should critique the art not in terms of its correspondence to reality or its social or moral nature, but rather in terms of its ability to perfect the given form, to be a well-executed play, poem, painting, etc. Just as the medium of the art should take precedence over its content, the criticism should focus on how well the art lives up to that medium. Further, criticism should itself be a creative endeavor, an artistic endeavor, as it is even further removed from reality than the art itself. Unlike Plato, who thought art was made worse by being merely a poor imitation of reality, which itself was a poor imitation of the forms, for the aestheticists, the act of making art should be directed away from preserving truth, and therefore the further something is from reality, the better art it can be. Making criticism of art that takes art as its subject is even better than the art itself because it's one step further removed, and that task of creating criticism shouldn't be moving backwards towards truth and reality by distilling and interpreting art into something pithy, but rather it should itself be a imaginative process of creation and artistic movement further from reality. Before moving on to the tenets of aestheticism, it's worthy to note that this description corresponds in many ways to Baudrillard's postmodern idea of simulacra and hyperreality, where a simulacrum is an imitation of something that is not fully based on the original, and hyperreality emerges when you have an imitation of an imitation that has become completely divorced from its original referent. In the same way that art may be representing the world, and the critic's commentary on that art could be a representation of a representation that, according to the aestheticist, should be fully divorced from the underlying truth of the reality. Now, there are some key differences. First, between the aestheticist view and Baudrillard's view, the aestheticists code this process positively, saying we should be moving away from truth, while Baudrillard generally codes it negatively, or not as positively. Further, Baudrillard is also concerned with the technological mediation of experience, something that was largely non-existent at the time of most of these aestheticists. Check out our video on simulacra for more on postmodernism and this idea of simulacra and hyperreality. Now, another component of aestheticism is the idea that art is above morality or moral critique. This is embodied in Wilde's famous claim, "There's no such thing as a moral or immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all." For the aestheticist, art cannot be wrong because it doesn't strive for some functionalist outcome in the world. It doesn't strive for some moral good. Good works of art are created solely for artistic effect, not to push some particular moral position. Similarly, art is independent of the desires of the public to attach a particular narrative or ideology to it. Just as the critic's job is not to explain or define the single correct interpretation of a piece of art, the public can't determine the purpose of a piece of art, as good art is made for itself, not for some other purpose. They should not judge the art based on how it makes them feel, merely its ability to execute its own form. These last 2 points, at least with respect to Wilde, may be seen in some ways as an attempt to deflect criticism from some of his works which were interpreted as homoerotic and therefore immoral in his time. Wilde was imprisoned for being gay, and his works were used as evidence of his guilt, a sentence that harmed his health and ultimately led to his death after he was released. By claiming that the meaning of art could not be defined by the public, and that art was above morality, he may have, beyond this broad philosophical view, have been trying to shield himself in some ways from the discriminatory mores of Victorian society that attempted to label his art something specific and claim that that thing was immoral. Now, a range of objections have been raised against aestheticism. One of the most common is the moral claim that objects to the idea that art is in some way beyond moral criticism, as it seems that art can be immoral or promote immoral views. In defense of this claim, the aestheticists could rely on the arguments of John Stuart Mill in his treatise On Liberty, which provides a substantial defense of free speech. Mill argues for near complete freedom of artistic expression and speech as the foundation of a free and just society. Check out our series on Mill and free speech for more. Now, note that Mill is going to defend a certain level of artistic expression, but not everything. Mill isn't going to defend using actual slave labor or sweatshops for the creation of an artistic piece. Rather, he's going to defend the idea of making a piece about sweatshops. But if there's an immoral component in the creation of the art, that's something that seems set aside from kind of this defense of free speech and free expression. Just to draw that line, check out the video on Mill's harm principle for more specifics around where exactly Mill draws that line between speech and something that could be considered harmful. Now, the proponent of the functionalist approach to art might respond that, in fact, art has a responsibility to provide moral instruction to the populace. That even if creating art that represents immorality isn't itself immoral, we should focus on and lift up art that champions morality and makes an ideological case for ethical behavior, because it's the duty of art to convince and educate, and because in doing so we create a more moral and better educated society. The aestheticists might respond that art is not the place for dictating what is right and wrong, but rather where we have a dialogue about what is right and wrong. Art is not imitating the already determined morals, but instead creating and imagining morality in new situations. It's not that art is in some way mimicking these morals that we already have, nor should it. Rather, art is the leading tip of the spear that is imagining the new possibilities that the world can be, and then life is eventually going to follow behind and imitate that art, and adopt or not adopt some of those morals that the art was pressing for to begin with. Now, from the realist camp, we might be concerned that if art is not a faithful representation of reality, it can subvert history, truth, and fact. This was Plato's original concern with quote-unquote poetry, as it could convince people of things that were not true without real philosophical argument. Documentaries are not what we remember about history. We remember the historical fictions that are exciting and engaging and drive your emotions, but may misrepresent the facts. The aestheticists might respond that convincing people of a claim or reproducing the truth is not the goal of art, and the fault lies not with the aestheticists that are trying to make art better, but rather with the realists that claim that the goal of art is to represent history or reality, when really they're just trying to make something beautiful. The problem arises from the realists lying to themselves about why they're making art, because why would they change the facts of history to be a better story if their goal truly was a realistic interpretation? This is for all of those films that are based on a true story. If our goal is to represent reality, we should be making a documentary. If our goal is to make art, we shouldn't be concerned about trying to make it correspond to reality. The realists might further object to some of the substantive claims of aestheticism, namely that often art does imitate life, and that there are many inventions of reality that arrive before art has imagined them. A more effective argument might be that art doesn't fully imitate life, nor does life fully imitate art. They, in fact, imitate each other, and in doing so collectively create new things. The realist might also be concerned that if life strives to imitate art, but is never able to, because art is, for the aestheticists, something that is above or beyond reality, that people may become disheartened or depressed because they're never able to achieve that artistic ideal in their lives, in the way that being surrounded by pictures of very skinny models or of your friends' vacations on social media can lead to depression because you're comparing their curated art with your reality instead of realizing that their reality is likely the same as yours. If we're surrounded by art that is more perfect, that is better than the reality that we're living, we may become depressed because we will try and we will strive, as the aestheticist says, to create that perfection in our lives, but finding that we cannot, we may think that actually that art is depicting something realistic, and we're simply failing to create that, and that that is a problem or a moral failing on our part. What do you think? Should art imitate reality or the other way around? Should critics try to elucidate the meaning of art or critique it solely on the basics of its form? Is art immune from moral criticism? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Subscribe, hit that notification bell if you like this video and you want to make sure you see more. Donate to us on Patreon if you want to support the channel, and stay skeptical, everybody.